Hey, how's it going guys? My name's Daniel, aka HashLips, and welcome back to my channel, where today I'm going to show you how I've built a plugin for the art engine that's gonna produce some interesting art. I've always had a fascination with printer color tests. If you have a printer, it sometimes prints these images out where there's an array of colors to test the values that it can print. And so I always found the aesthetic of these tests very interesting. And so I want to use the art engine to reproduce this essentially, but using HTML div elements. Let me show you how I've built this and actually how you can play around with it too. If you've never heard of the art engine before, it's a tool that me and Lyarko made in order for us to generate NFTs. So head over to hashlips.io and scroll all the way to the bottom. The left-hand side of repos are repos that I use for making videos. And on the right side is the proper art engine documentation and the actual repo. So if you go here, you can go to the documentation, click on tools, and on the art engine, discover more. Here you can see all the documentation around how the plugins work and the actual engine, and you can also find the true GitHub repository over here. And on top of that, if you go to my YouTube channel, which you are already here, you might as well subscribe and turn that bell notification on if you want to see more content like this. And please give this video a thumbs up. I really do appreciate the feedback and the comments that you guys put on these videos. Anyway, on the playlist section, you can go and check out the Art Engine 2.0, and in here you'll find an abundance of playlist items that you can go through. And so this will teach you how the Art Engine works and some of the different plugins involved. And for this series, I thought I'm going to clone the repo and then start my own repository where I make new plugins and plugins that we can explore different avenues of art with. And that's exactly what this video is all about. So if you want to follow along just purely with this video series, then I'm going to show you the repo that you can download. As always, if you are going to follow along, I highly recommend that you have Node.js installed and an IDE. I usually use Visual Studio Code. So the repo that you want to go to is, if you go to github.com/hashlips and you click on all my repositories that I have, I've got a new one and it's called Art Engine Template with Plugins. And this is the one that I'm going to be working with in this video series. So it's very important that you follow along with this particular repo. So you can download the code here and then follow along. I do split out the project in branches. So you'll see I've got a main branch, and then we actually have the new plugin that I've worked on over here on a new branch itself, and it's called HTML CSS Art. So let's go ahead and clone the repo. Let's copy the URL and let's open up a terminal and navigate to where you want to save this. I'm going to save mine on my desktop. So I'm going to say git clone and then paste in that URL, and then it's going to clone the repo to my machine. So once this is done, I'm going to open this up in VS Code. Now in Visual Studio Code, I've opened up the repo. We can see here's the art engine, but of course there's a few things we need to do. So in the terminal, we're going to open a new one. We're going to type in node-v to make sure that we have a Node version installed. I've got version 16. I'm pretty sure that's fine, but you can use the latest versions as well. Of course, the next thing for us to do is to run npm I or npm install, or you can use yarn. However, I'm just going to use npm to install our dependencies. So now that we have this installed, if you've looked at the previous Art Engine videos, if you go to the index.ts, this is basically where we get to run the Art Engine. And so where we configure it, where we set up the inputs, the generators, the renderers, and the exporters. So just as a general test, I'm just going to run it once, and we see that we're going to generate about 20 pieces of art. You'll also notice that the data that I have is much different than the purple eyes that I always used to have in these art engines. It's much more well thought out art pieces that I've made myself to experiment with as we code along. So the next thing for us to do is to run npm run start. And so this will start, it will build the TS and actually start the Art Engine. And as you can see, we're getting it to generate some data. Pretty soon we should have our output file, and indeed it's done. And there we go. We have our metadata, of course, for NFTs exported. But most importantly, we've got these images of these art pieces exported. Let me know in the comments what you think about these art pieces. I would love to know as well. But this is not the purpose of this video today. I just wanted you to see the base plugins as the Art Engine is, because now we're going to switch to the correct branch. Before we switch to the new branch, I want to mention that in this setup, how the Art Engine works, if you watch those previous videos, you'll notice we have a cache folder. And so the Art Engine has a flow of first running the inputs, and then the generators, and then of course the renderers, and at the end the exporters. But the cache file holds the config of what each I would say step generates. And this is important because we're going to change this, of course, with new custom plugins that the Art Engine doesn't have but has now in the new branch that exports different data. And some of the data we could have actually reused from existing plugins, but the naming conventions didn't make sense. And so I just recreated some of the old plugins, which you'll see just now. So let's go ahead and at the branch section, move over to the new branch that I've made. And so if you get this message, essentially you maybe have log files that changed. I'm just going to revert this so that I can actually switch over easily. And there we go. So we've switched over to the new branch. It's called HTML CSS Art. Okay. And now you'll notice that we've got a few new things. Firstly, we've got this new elements folder. And these are the new data that we are going to use. Essentially, these are pieces of HTML. They are divs with colors in them. And now I just want to explain exactly what we're going to do. Now let's close the elements for just a sec. And I also want to run npm-i. And the reason is in the new branch, there's some new libraries that's being used. So I just want to make sure that we've got those dependencies installed. So it's important that you do that if you are in the new branch. So let's wait for that to happen. While we wait for the dependencies to install, what we can do to illustrate what we actually want this plugin to execute is we can go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this test.html like so, and then create some base HTML elements. So I've got my HTML over here. I've got a head tag where I have some styling the body HTML, all the divs, and then I have a separate one for divs as well. Just giving it that base styling for us to use. And the majority of what we're going to generate is going to be in between these body tags. So in between the body tags is where we want to actually inject some divs to produce these colors. But when we go back to this print color test, we can see that there are colors that's rendered either in rows or in column way fashion, right? And so this is what we want to replicate, but to an extreme level where we can actually produce an artwork from it. So this is the purpose of our test file. I want to show you how we're going to get that right. So for example, if we go to our elements, which are predefined divs with colors that I've made and also gave a name to, I'm going to just simply copy one like this one, right? And we can see that it's a div that's displaying flex and has a direction of column, and then just has a few divs with background colors in them. So I'm going to close the elements, open up my test, and then paste this right here in the body. And so this is what we want the Art Engine to automatically do for us, right? But for now, I'm just going to manually put it there. I do have a plugin installed in VS Code that allows you to just right-click on the file and host it. It's called Live Service. You can install that if you want to, or you can simply just open this file in the browser. So I'm going to click on Live Server, and now what we get to see are these divs of color that just renders like this, almost like that print test, right? So we can also inspect this and then have the selection tool on. And so if I hover over these, you can see the divs individually rendered over here. And so this is what we want to take to another level, like I want to say, right? We want to have the art engine generate many of these colors and fit them together in a random way, but still in a controlled way so that we can produce an artwork. Okay, so let's see how we're going to make this work. Now, I'm going to clear the terminal by pressing Command K, and then I'm simply going to delete my test because we're not going to need this. This was just for me to illustrate what this plugin is going to do. Let's take a closer look at the data. So we've got elements, and we do have this data folder with all the old images, but this is not what we're going to use. So I made a new folder with elements, and this is the data source that we will use. Each one of these slots has a name, slot 1 underscore underscore Z1, and you'll see it goes from Z1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 9. This is the order that it's going to render in. And each of these slots has exactly the same data. It's essentially these div elements with colors, like I said, right? If we look at this one, this is the desert dusk column, and then we have got desert dusk row. So it's exactly the same. The only difference is that one is a row and one displays as column. And the reason why I did this like this and not manage this by code is because I really wanted it to be a part of the trait names and not change the plugins, the existing plugins and how they work too much. So there's going to be a duplicate of each, and then one is just displaying row and one is a column. And I've made many of these with some having many colors, some having little, some having one color, right? And some having a lot of rainbow colors. So this is our data source, and essentially it's just these divs with colors in them. So keep that in mind. So we have our elements, and now it's time to look at the index.ts. So this is very similar to what the actual art engine has. It also has the index.ts. But here you can see that for inputs, we've got these new plugins that I'm going to go through one by one. For example, the inputs, we've got HTML layers input for the generator. We've got the HTML layers attributes generator, and so on. Now, it's important to note at this stage, when you have installed the node modules, when you have ran npm I, you can definitely run npm run start. And what will happen is at this point, it will just use the data and the elements and actually produce an output. And you can see there's the HTML. Now, I'm not going to give this away just yet. I just want to show that it works off the bat. What I want to just illustrate before we get to the results is how this exactly works. I'm going to delete that output folder and also delete the cache file. The dist is generated, which I can just leave for now. But in order for us to understand exactly what's happening, I'm going to remove all the exporters, or just comment them out, as well as the renderers, as well as the generators. And the first plugin that we are going to look at is actually the input. And where we find these custom plugins will always be in the custom section over here. And if we navigate to inputs, we can see here is our HTML layers input. Now, we'll run through this quickly, but just keep in mind, currently when we run the art engine, we simply going to just run the inputs. The generators, renderers, and exporters are now going to not run because there is no plugins for them. And we're going to focus on each step one by one. So you truly understand how this works, and if you want to go and modify it, where to go and modify what. Starting at the index.ts, we can see that we have a lot of custom imports over here. But the one that we are going to focus on now is the HTML layers input, which we are using as the input parameter, or the input plugin in this case. The reason why I just recreated the image layers input, or the static image layers input, is because of the naming convention. At the end of the day, it would make sense for me to refer to this as HTML layers. And so, although it works exactly the same as the core plugin, I just duplicated this and reintroduced this as a custom plugin, but in essence, it does the same thing. So, for example, we can give it a asset base path, which we're pointing to the elements. And if we run the generation now, we will see that we get the cache file, but the only data that we get is in the inputs JSON. We do not get the generators because we have commented that as well as the renderers out. So let's focus on the inputs JSON that this specific plugin generates for us. So it gives us basically this object, which is the base element is the HTML, and then we get the base path to all the files. Then we get layers, and in the layers we get these objects for each slot, essentially each folder. And of course, in each of these folders, we have some data about itself, especially in the Z index. As you can see, we've got the base Z index set as 1, and that is true because if we look at the elements, we can see that it is __ Z1. And then, of course, we have the options, and the options being all the available div elements or HTML files that's available to us that exist in this folder. And so this has its own data. It has a name, it has a weight, and the weights are all set to 10 via the __ W10. And this just determines the rarity. And then, of course, we have things like the path to this file. It can also have optional Z, Y, and X offsets. And then something like the last modified time as well as the size. And some edge cases, which we don't have in this case. But in essence, this is exactly the same data that we get as if we were to use one of the core plugins for the inputs instead of our custom inputs. For example, if I were to import this to say inputs, and then instead of here, I can say I want to use the inputs.image layer inputs like so. This is one of the core plugins from the Art Engine. And if I go ahead and delete the cache, so I can just go here, remove that completely, and I run the Art Engine, it is going to work. And it is going to actually give us that input again. And it's not going to make a difference at all. So in technical sense, what I could have used is the image layers input and then just carry on with my custom inputs, and it would work because it generates the same data. The only difference is, and the reason why I remade it is because I just felt like it doesn't really make sense for me to say image layers input, and instead I wanted it to say give me the HTML layers input, which essentially is exactly the same as what you'll find in the core plugins, but just with a better naming convention. Maybe I can just call this file inputs layer, and I think that would make more sense, or files layer input, because technically these could be any files, right? So I just wanted to illustrate that, and just so that you know, you can work through this inputs plugin that I've made. It's exactly the same, like I said, apart from naming convention changes, but I thought I'll bring it to the top and include it in the custom plugin so that you can even play with it as well. The second plugin I want to focus on is actually the generator. Now again, same story with the generator. It's known as the HTML layers attributes generator because the generator itself exports attributes as well as what it should generate, right? And so again, same story. This also exists in the core plugins under the generators, but it's known as image layer attributes generators. And so I did the same thing. So if I go to my generators, I just gave it a better name, but it works exactly the same. Over here is where we try and identify all the inputs that we have available to us, and then with randomness, generate which items we should consider as part of a generation. For example, which layers should go on top of one another based on a random number that is generated, and of course based on the seed that it got. The only thing that's different from the way that this generator works versus the core plugin one is that if I go into it, we can see that here at the bottom, we have the kind that it exports. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to get an export of attributes, and this is the kind of it. And we're also going to get the layers that it should generate. And this time I named it HTML layers. And this now will only work, or this kind of data would only work following the other plugins if it matches this kind. It will make sense a bit later on, but this is the only thing that I've really changed when it comes to the output of this plugin. So let's go ahead and run this now, keeping in mind that we have the input. So of course, here is our inputs, but now if we go to generators, we can see what it generated. And the generators generates an object which have their own objects named 1 to 20, or how many generations we want. And each one of these is an array. And basically, if we close this down, we can see the first array or the first object in the array actually holds the attributes. It holds things like the DNA and also what the attributes are called. But this is not the layers themselves. This we can find in the second object, and here you can see the kind as the layers. So this also has data as assets as an array, and each one of these assets literally is what it should generate or what it should render in the next step. For example, we can open one and we can see that there's a path to a file. We can see the offset that it needs to render at, and that's all we care about. When it comes to naming conventions of this trait, we can find that inside our attributes. And that's how it basically works, right? So we use the attributes and we use the render layers separately, because some people want to just generate the images and some people want to actually generate the item's metadata as well as the images at the end of the day. But we are working with HTML, and at some point we need to convert the HTML to an image. So that's why the kind is very important here. All right, let's move on to the renderers and see what has changed. Now, there are two renderers here, and I'm going to uncomment them. The custom renderer that we're going to dive into now is the HTML layers generator or layers renderer. This is the new one, but this one is using the core plugin because it has the same kind as the attributes. And we know that we have the item attribute generator kind interface, so it will work with the core plugin. I hope this starts to make sense. I know that it is complex, but look, you do not need to know all of this if you just want to use it. This is purely for someone who wants to dive deep and start changing some of the code as well. However, it's important to note that we have two renderers. We've got the item attribute renderer from the core art engine, and now we have our new HTML layers renderer, which we're going to take a look at. So if we go to the custom plugins, we can see here it is. And let's dive into this plugin in specific, because this is the new plugin that we are going to unpack and see how do we actually get these div elements rendered in a base HTML file. As we know, the art engine now will take what the generator has generated and take it in as input into the renderers. So I'm not going to cover the item attributes because that's how we know it works. It will literally take these attributes and just re-render them, getting it ready for the exporter to export metadata. But the layers renderer is now going to take the layers section of what the generator provided for us. For example, it's going to specifically look at this kind of data where it says HTML layers generator interface and go through this array and one by one inject that HTML. So how does our custom renderer work? Well, in essence, we define the temp folder. We have some interfaces, namely the interface we expect the renderer to export, an assets interface to know what kind of data we work with, And then, of course, we get access to those layers via our items data manager. But essentially, the Art Engine runs this render function. And so the first thing we do is we check if we've got renders, we loop over them, and then we identify and see if the type matches. When we know that we've got data of a certain kind that we can accept and work with, we're good to go. So what we then do is we flatten that into a flattened map. We then go and we sort through those assets, and we sort it via the Z index or the Z offset, because we want them to render in a chronological order, and arrays by default sometimes can mix it up, right? So we need to make sure that we sort it correctly before we render it. And the part that we inject this into the HTML is very easy. We firstly set up an HTML file in the temp directory of the cache. We then seed it with some data, and the data that we seed it with is actually HTML. But the interesting part is that we take those assets and then just read the file and inject that into our HTML. And then, of course, we save that file, and we also attach a new type that we want the next plugin to work with. In this case, the HTML layered images renderer interface. I can probably remove images from here. Doesn't make sense to have that there because these are just HTML files. However, when we have this now and I run the Art Engine with these two renderers in it, we can see that in the renders JSON, we now get these objects, and in each one of these, we get two objects in the array, much like the generator. The first one is for the attributes. Remember, this has to do with the metadata, which we don't care about right now. It works with the core plugin. But the one that we care about is the second one. Now we have this data kind, and this is the final export, and it gives us a path to this file. So if we look in the temp directory, we should find it over here. And now if we go and host this live or open it in the browser, we can actually start seeing the artworks in the temp directory. So I can go to the second one or the third one, and we start seeing these images that very much resembles these printer colored tests, which I really love and enjoy. And I almost feel like I'm going to print this out, make it into an art piece and actually hang it on my wall because it's just so cool and vibrant and colorful. And on top of it all, these are div elements, right? I can still go into my selector and select each one individually, which is very cool. And remember, with this engine, we can now generate web pages. I know they are going to probably not make sense, but the possibilities are endless, right? And that is pretty cool, right? But we are not even done yet. So far, we have introduced the inputs, so we know what data we're going to use. We have a generator. We know how the data is going to be generated, as well as we use the core items renderer and our new HTML layers renderer, which gives us this temp folder full of new HTML art. But we are not done, because the last plugins that I want to actually talk to is how do we now turn these HTML, I would say, web pages into actual art. And so I made these two plugins, which is known as the HTML exporter, and the other one is known as HTML to PNG exporter. And then, of course, we have the normal ERC 721 metadata, which we all know. So just to give you an example, these two very much just copies these HTML files over into the output folder. So we have our metadata that we are used to with NFTs, as well as we've got a folder for these HTML files. So these are still HTML files, like you can see, but that's not what we want. We want the PNG version Otherwise, our metadata is simply not going to match up because we need images, right? We can keep it purely HTML, but images in an art form works better to display in certain situations. And so the custom plugin that I've made for that is this HTML to PNG exporter. So if we go to the exporters, we're going to focus on this one right now. And let's just talk through what does it do. The plugin itself is very straightforward and the final step for us to achieve our end result. So firstly, it's simply a plugin that uses the exporter interface. All plugins need to use their respective interfaces. And then in the constructor, we get to accept a width and a height for our final output. If we don't specify it, we're going to use 800 by 600. We initialize everything. We set up the paths. We set up the output paths to where we want these to export. We make sure that we have these files and folders in their respective places. And again, we go ahead and we check for these certain data kinds that we need to work with. Interesting, we actually check for the attributes as well. And the reason for that is because we want to use from the attributes the DNA section. So even though the DNA or the attributes has nothing to do with this step, technically in the name I want to use DNA, and that's why I have to check if there are attributes present. Okay, and then it's very, very straightforward. So essentially what we're doing here is we are making use of a library, and it's called Puppeteer. Now, Puppeteer is a library that essentially allows you to display and work with HTML data, right, and files. So we essentially host the HTML, and then we kind of screenshot it in our format and in our size. And you can use various tools to do this. This is just, for me, what I decided to use. So I'm going to save it all, and then I'm going to simply run it. Now, we've hit a bit of a roadblock, and I had to investigate what was going wrong, and I couldn't find anything wrong with the code, but I'm going to try a higher node version. So as you can see, if I go here, I've got node 16, but I'm going to use NVM use 18 so I can use a higher version of node. I'm using now node 18.17, and then we're going to rerun it. And hopefully now it should work. There it goes. Okay. So in a sense, now we are trying to render the HTML to PNG. And in the outputs folder, you can actually see the PNGs being rendered. So it takes some time, this process, because it needs to open the file, take a screenshot, and close it, and do this over and over. But in essence, this is working, right? It's producing the PNG print test artworks that we tried to achieve. And so I thought this was a very cool plugin to share with you guys. And you know, I always like making these plugins and trying these artwork things out, and seeing that we have the art engine and we can just build plugins for it. I thought it's something interesting to share, but you let me know, what are you going to create with this tool? And would you like me to create more plugins like these? Anyway, apart from that, I really do hope that you've enjoyed this video today. And till the next time, have a beautiful day. Cheers for now.